and welcome everyone and good afternoon. Thank you for joining us at the UACES plenary session of Equal and Inclusive Responsibility and Transformation in European Studies. I'm Katharine Wright from Newcastle University. I'm also was the UACES Equality, Diversity and Inclusion, or EDI officer until last week when my term ended, and the position has now been taken over by the very fabulous Roberta Garina. So to give a little bit of a background before I introduce our speakers to this panel, UACES, like other professional associations, has come late to work on equality and diversity. But we are seeking to address this now and make it a priority in our work going forward. Over the last couple of years, we've created an EDI policy, we've updated our code of conduct and complaints procedure, but we also acknowledge that there is an incredible amount more work to do beyond these policy commitments. Going forward, the EDI officer will provide momentum to UACES work in this area, working with the other officers, the trustees, and also our members, and developing an action plan for implementing this work. So this panel discussion then is a means for us, but also you, to get a sense of the big picture of issues related to equality and inclusivity within European studies to guide that work, examining where responsibility for such transformation lies and what role institutions, but also individuals have. So we've convened this panel of experts working on or in European studies, bringing together academics and practitioners to examine what we should be doing to transform European studies and ensure that it becomes an inclusive space. So we're going to consider issues such as decolonising Europe, the EU policy-making sphere, teaching European studies, journal publishing, and the role UACES as an organisation and us as individuals have in challenging established practices. So we're going to proceed as follows. So first, I'm going to introduce distinguished speakers. Then I'm going to turn to each of the speakers. I've given them each a very specific question relating to their expertise. And then we have some broader questions for the panel. We aim to have about a 40 to 45-minute panel discussion on those questions. And then we very much want to open up to you, the audience, for your questions. So we're going to go to questions after the panel, and we'll use the raise hand function under the participants button on Zoom, but we'll also take questions from the chat function. So if it's easier for you and you prefer, then please do feel free to contribute to the discussion using the chat function as we go along, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. So I'm going to give a very brief introduction to our distinguished speakers. So first up, we have Anil Awesti, who is a senior teaching fellow and senior tutor in the Centre for Lifelong Learning at the University of Warwick. His research interests are in widening participation to higher education, in particular issues related to access, participation, retention, and the progression of students from non-traditional backgrounds in universities. He chairs a number of projects related to widening participation and also anti-racist pedagogy and process. He's got a background in European studies, doing both doctoral and postdoctoral research focused on local and regional development in the European Union. Next up, we have Beste Işleyen, who is an assistant professor in political science at the University of Amsterdam. Her research interests lie in international relations, critical security studies, and international political sociology. She has worked on European Union engagement with the Southern Mediterranean, with a focus on peace and conflict, counterterrorism, socio-economic development, and civil society promotion. And along with Tanzin Anwar, Beste convenes the Amsterdam Centre for European Studies online lecture series, Decolonising Europe in International Politics, which launched this summer, and the first series is available on YouTube and very much recommended reading or viewing. And then we have Kékéli Kpognon, who is a Human Rights Senior Programme Officer at the Quaker Council for European Affairs, which is based in Brussels. Kékéli leads projects that seek to promote a human rights-based approach to European policymaking and implementation on the topic of migration. Her work aims to improve narratives about migration by implementing the language used in political discourse. Kékéli has an academic background in migration, mobility and development, and has spent more than a decade working with migrant-led organisations, NGOs and platforms in Europe and Africa. And then last but not least, in my randomly selected order of introducing our speakers, we have Toni Haastrup, who is Senior Lecturer in International Politics at the University of Stirling. Her research looks and uses a critical feminist lens to understand the feminist policy practices of regional security institutions, including the European Union and African Union. She's also, of course, Editor-in-Chief of JCMS, the Journal of Common Market Studies. Toni also is a project coordinator for the Jean Monnet Project, Diversity, Inclusion and Multidisciplinary in European Studies, which UACES has partnered with the European Studies Association of Sub-Saharan Africa to get funding for. So that was a very brief, although it seemed longer than I thought, introduction to all of our speakers. So now I'm going to go to our first set of questions, and I'm going to ask the speakers to try and keep to 4 minutes. I'll message you if you start to go over time. So the first question I have is for Anil. So given kind of your background working in terms of widening participation, I wondered if you could talk to us a little bit about how we can think about better attracting, in inverted commas, non-traditional students to European studies. And if you have thoughts on what work we need to do to our own curriculums to support this. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Katharine. So my particular area of interest and research in this field concerns the experiences of students of colour within UK higher education institutions. And when I and colleagues engage with students of colour across the country, two core themes, two core pieces of feedback come from them. One is in general terms, and it's essentially that students of colour generally have a negative experience in all of their interactions within the university space. That's both the academic and the professional service spaces. So that extends beyond the classroom to well-being, career services, campus security, etc., etc. So that's kind of a general kind of first piece of feedback. And the second one's more specific to us is actually the theme which emerges, and the equally damning theme which emerges in the classroom and the experience in the classroom. And a few kind of core issues come from students of colour in this area. One is that they feel very isolated. They feel as if race and issues of racism are not discussed, and if they are discussed, they're discussed in a very kind of superficial, very brief manner, often bracketed or confined to 1 week or kind of one topic within the wider kind of learning experience or within the year itself. They feel as if their lived experiences are not recognised or discussed within the actual issues that they are being encouraged to engage with. Some feel actively silenced within the classroom, be it consciously or unconsciously actively silenced by staff members, by lecturers and tutors themselves. And actually some, extremely worryingly, have explicitly used the language of the classroom as a violent space, and a space within which they feel it is violent towards them. So quite, as you can imagine, quite kind of, as you can see, quite damning feedback, quite strong kind of themes which emerge. And so the second part of the question, is around what work do we need to do in our curriculums? And curriculum content is clearly important. Yeah, students of colour need to see themselves and their lived experiences in the curriculum itself. And this is very much dominated the conversation in this area, encapsulated by the term of decolonising the curriculum and everything that comes with that. And so we have a job on our hands within the disciplines of European studies to incorporate non-European influences, perspectives, experiences, stories within our teaching of Europe and the history of the development of Europe, which is clearly and intimately linked to the history of the development of the wider world. Our narration of the development of Europe needs to move beyond the geographical bounds of Europe itself, because that only provides a very partial picture of the story. So curriculum content is very important. However, one of my critiques of this discussion is that it has been very much focused on the issue of curriculum, which I believe is an overly reductionist response to the complexities of the actual challenges and issues facing us. This isn't just about reading lists. It goes way beyond reading lists. What I believe is required is actually a cultural change in our pedagogical approaches in order to create classroom spaces which are positive for students of colour. And I think one core way, one fruitful way of doing that is to engage with anti-racist pedagogy itself. And there's four things I just want to very quickly and very briefly touch upon here, what I'm getting at more specifically. First of all, to challenge the assumptions inbuilt in our disciplines. And that's what I mean by that is to learn to critique the ways that the disciplines and the teaching of our disciplines have historically been oppressive. At the same time as questioning what counts as legitimate knowledge and whose knowledge counts within our disciplines themselves. That's the first thing. Second thing is to develop our students' awareness of their own social positions and self-reflexivity, particularly when it comes to issues of race and racism and their own relationship to issues of race and racism. Thirdly, a very important role for tutors, for lecturers, for tutors, to ensure that a discussion of difficult and uncomfortable issues takes place in the classroom. What I mean by that are issues such as institutionalized racism, oppression, white privilege, etc., etc. A fundamental role there for tutors to ensure these issues are broached and not ignored. And finally, it's to create a sense of community within the classroom through collaborative learning. And through that approach, ensuring that the voices of the marginalized are very much included within that process. And I believe by taking this more holistic approach to overcoming the challenges, so yes, it's about curriculum, but it's about things beyond the curriculum itself, beyond reading lists. Holistic way of overcoming the challenges rather than one purely focused on diversifying reading lists. I'll leave it there for now.
Great, thank you, Anil. So, well, very important points there. I think we can all kind of learn and reflect on in our own teaching. So I'm gonna go, so yeah, in terms of the questions, we're gonna jump across a few issues, but hopefully it should kind of all come together in the end when we move in terms of the broader discussions, because there's a lot of different aspects to the issue we're discussing. So I'm going to move to Kékéli next, if that's okay. So Kékéli, I know you've written about this over the summer in the context of kind of the Black Lives Matter. And I wondered if you could tell us about the issues regarding equalities and representation in Brussels and European policy-making circles, and maybe reflect a little bit on how this impacts your work at QC, at the Quaker Council for European Affairs, but also perhaps reflect a little bit on how European studies is implicated in creating this very kind of white space. Thank you.
Anil's remarks on student experiences continue in the professional setting in the Brussels bubble. People who, in addition to having theoretical knowledge of policy issues, have lived experience of them, are being pushed away because of a lack of objectivity or being seen too close to system of oppression, to actually contribute to change. There's the hashtag Brussels So White that is a few years old, and that really came out of a deep sense of frustration of at best being ignored or actively being undermined or being at the receiving end of hostility in the policy-making world. In terms of how that lack of representation translates in the work that we do, I think it is about the preference for the linear, the one-dimensional policies and a certain group thinking because the group is so homogeneous. It also means lack of nuance. And I'll take migration as an example because it's an area I work on. And it's fascinating to see how EU discourse on migration management policies and the contestation of those policies is based on the premise of botched up implementation of migration management, but not on the idea that I found problematic of the need to manage migration of people from the global south coming to Europe. And at no point the connections are made between current practices and the very long European history of dysfunctional migration and migration management and labor management of Africans that were the transatlantic slave trade or forced movement of population during colonization. And so those assumptions are also the assumption that the European way of life needs to be promoted, which is, there's a commission dedicated to that. What does European studies have anything to do with that? I think I find striking when I look at the Brussels bubble that utter belief that many colleagues have, and it's within institution and NGO sector alike, that Europe is an unequivocal force for good, that there is a confidence in the superiority of European ways and a sense of purpose and drive of going away to bestow some of those European attributes, democracy, peace, human rights, justice, to people who are lacking. I think there's also a lack of curiosity that comes with that sense of being so fully European that there's no space for other perspective or yes. And I think I'm also puzzled that I don't know what the curriculum entails, but the sense that European history started in 1957, which ironically were time of empires. France still had colonies. Britain was on its journey to give independence, but these were time of empire. But connections are not made. And finally, as a preparation for this topic, I went and I looked at the first year curriculum of one of the universities that is in the top 10 of European studies. And for 2019, so students that enrolled last year, in the first year, there were 3 references to colonialism in course descriptions. And this is a material that students read before choosing to embark on the course. And there was 1 mention of slavery. And all of those were in elective. That meant that somebody had to get out of their way to be able to grapple with those issues. And I think that those silences in European studies accompany the students into their professional lives. And if we want to talk about transformation and I guess in the bubble policies are for the express purposes of fulfilling sustainable development goals, then these gaps need to be addressed quite urgently.
Great, thank you, Kékéli. So I think that moves us quite nicely on to some reflections perhaps from Beste. So we have this Decolonizing Europe and International Politics online research series, seminar series that you launched or co-launched this summer. And I wondered perhaps if you could reflect on kind of what the motivations for that were and what you're really aiming to do, what conversation you're trying to start. Thank you.
Thanks, Katharine. So I also, with this opportunity, want to thank my partner in crime, I would say, Tasnim Anwar, with whom I co-convened this series, and we are co-organizing this series. So our series started before the summer. We had our kickoff event on the 17th of June. We had 5 sessions, which you can find on the YouTube channel of the Amsterdam Institute for Social Science Research. And we will be restarting on September 23rd, and we have again a full program in which we will try to bring this decolonizing research agenda in a dialogue with European studies. So if you ask us our key motivation for organizing this series, my answer would be the following. So we want to amplify existing efforts to bring European studies in close dialogue with decolonial and post-colonial approaches. However, the idea of convening this series is based on our experiences for many years. So it's not just grasping the moment in which these debates are already taking place around the world, and we wanted to grasp this opportunity and organize this series. We have, so Tasnim and I are both teaching and doing research in topics related to Europe, broadly understood, and in European studies. And our experiences in the classroom and exchanges at and beyond our institution has shown that the field is still very Eurocentric. And this is not only our observation. I think many colleagues have already pointed this out. So our attempt is to create a platform in which we explore new research agendas by relying on insights from decolonial and post-colonial approaches. So our key question is, in what ways does a decolonial research agenda make visible academic and public issues and topics that have so far been rendered invisible? So that's our key motivation. So coming back to the question about Eurocentrism that we observe in our curriculum and in our studies, we see it in debates that are directly related to how we debate Europe. So key topics of international relations, political science, but also social sciences in general, for example, modernity, international law, human rights, and sovereignty. All these topics that are core concepts of social sciences in general, these are very Eurocentric. So our aim is to provide a platform in which we can offer some non-Eurocentric understandings of these topics. So therefore, in our previous series, we have dealt with the issues of modernity. In our kickoff event, we have talked about modernity. In our second event, we talked about the missing, let's say, focus on race in the broader international relations discipline. And then we moved to, for example, issues of capitalism, democracy, and Islam, and how Eurocentric the teaching and researching of these topics are. So I also want to give some background to these debates about the Eurocentric, let's say, tendencies in European studies. And I want to mention maybe 2 ways in which Eurocentrism features in our teaching and research. And one is one relates to how we treat Europe as a space. So the main tendency is to treat Europe or the European Union as a self-sustained space. And also I'm building on what Kékéli and also Anil have already pointed out, that when we are talking about Europe or the European Union, when we talk about events, developments, and ideas, we take these events as happens in Europe as a self-contained space without necessarily reflecting on the interactions with actors and also spaces outside Europe. So other actors and their agency are largely missing in our teaching and research. So we therefore disconnect Europe and also the European Union from the wider historical and social connections. However, these connections that are omitted are foundational to the idea of Europe, but also the European Union. And Kékéli also mentioned about colonialism. For example, in our kickoff event with Professor Gurminder Bamra, it was about how colonialism has almost no presence in our debates about the European Union, but also the European history. So colonialism has always been treated as independent or separate from modernity, whereas colonialism is foundational to the idea of modernity. But these debates are hardly taking place in our classrooms, but also the conferences that we attend or the academic exchanges that we have. So therefore, we need to engage more with the questions about colonial history, but also broader social relations of violence, dispossession, and racial inequalities when debating about Europe. And the second way in which Eurocentrism features has a temporal aspect, that we create some temporal hierarchies between Europe and the rest of the world. So when we teach about Europe and Europe's relations with the outside world, we tend to argue that any progress is attributed to Europe and the others are always catching up with Europe, they are always lagging behind. So this temporal hierarchy, however, is only possible if we omit certain events and certain ideas from our narrative about let's say, modernity or international law or human rights, etc. So we ignore events because they do not fit into the Eurocentric accounts of what is modernity, let's say. So in our second panel, for example, we hosted Professor Robbie Shilliam, whose work on the Haitian Revolution is very important to show us that when we talk about modernity, we tend to exclude, for example, the Haitian Revolution as the first anti-slavery movement, because it doesn't fit into the Eurocentric narrative that these revolutions happened first in Europe and also in the self-contained space of Europe. So our aim with the series is to challenge these narratives by bringing into focus those events, ideas, and also empirical facts that have been omitted from the classical accounts of many issues that we discuss in European studies.
Thank you, Beste. So the next question is, of course, for Toni. So I wondered, Toni, if you could tell us a little bit about the work that JCMS has been doing to address equalities issues and kind of diversify representation within the journal. So what you see as kind of the opportunities and also what challenges you face doing that. Thank you.
All right, thanks very much, Katharine. I guess the first thing to say is that the work that JCMS is doing is not far removed from what our professional association, which is UACES, is actually doing. And so I would say now publicly that we've been quite lucky to have chairs as well as an executive director who sees our vision and considers equality, diversity, and inclusion to be quite intrinsic, not just to how the organization functions or the journal functions, but to European studies itself. We took over JCMS, myself and Richard Whitman, as joint editors-in-chief with 4 other co-editors in 2017. And I would say I think fundamentally you have to create a space where this conversations can happen. And we've been lucky that we've been able to do that because you have to have fellow travelers with you who believe in what, who believe fundamentally in the idea that equality or diversity and inclusion are goods in of themselves, not just means to an end. And so we've had our co-editors, we decided that our co-editors should be global as a way to sort of unpick the it's still quite Anglo-centric, but slightly differently. The focus is very much on Europe and in the UK. So before us, we did have an editor-in-chief that was based in Canada, but we've also broadened that a bit to have another editor who's based on the African continent in South Africa. So one of the practical things that we did in our application to take over the journal, we were very clear that this was important to us as much as the things that we think should be important in journal publishing. So excellence, originality, and maintaining the journal and sort of caretaking the journal for members of UACES and beyond. But one of the things that we instituted as a practical way to sort of actually implement diversity, sort of thinking about special issues, for example. It is our job as editors, in a way, as much as we really don't want to be. We are gatekeepers of knowledge. I think any editor would admit that. It's a very powerful position. And I think the first step has to be acknowledging that power. And that was, I think, speaking for myself, very much a learning curve that, I'm not just doing this job because it's about processing articles, but actually I'm also in a position to have a say in what kind of knowledge about Europe we have. And sort of going off of what everybody else has said before me, we're very aware of this. We're very aware of the silences that exist within European studies. We're very aware of the types of people who create knowledge. So the fact that, well, actually our journal has been complicit in creating knowledge hierarchies about European studies. In a way, that's what it means to be a top journal of any field. So how do you redress this? And how do you redress it in a way that is not tokenistic, but actually thinks more systematically about reparations, in precisely because European integration, the idea of the common market is very much tied to the colonial history of Europe, but also indeed the European Union. I mean, fundamental to European integration itself is its relationship with former colonies of member states. So, we took on a sort of the job of trying to promote the journal outside of the usual circles. Secondly, we focused on our special issues and instituted a policy that we would never have a special issue that wasn't a mixed group of guest editors proposing. So we have men and women. We're thinking about equality more generally, but also we want a diverse in terms of early career researchers, more senior academic, mid-career researchers. We also want a diversity of regions. And this is something that we took to be very important in sort of rethinking about who can produce knowledge about the European Union. We also consider, for example, in constituting our jury for the Best Article Prize, that these types of representations are also made in terms of the jury, and it's a consideration in them thinking about who the prize should go to. Now, we've not been successful with everything. So I would say one of the biggest weaknesses currently of JCMS has to do with the editorial board. The editorial board has always been one that is quite expert, and but it's also one that is very white. It's one that is mostly of people who are based in Europe or in the United States, even not necessarily other parts of North America. And that's something that, we've had at the back of our mind for a really long time, and been thinking about how do we actually deal with that? And we are working on it, but it's not been as easy as we thought it would be, because you have all of this ideas. But that's certainly something that we're working on, and we do really need to work on that, because representation is not everything, but it is important. It is important to signal that you are open to these other forms of knowledge. How else can you signal that you're open to these other forms of knowledge if you don't have people on the editorial board who are able to champion this and to show to those people who might put in articles, for example, to JCMS, that this is something that we're open to. So I think, in terms of practical interventions, that's what we've done so far, and that's what we are doing. I think there's still a lot to say about the context within which JCMS as a journal, as a top journal, exists. And I think we can't forget that. We exist in a context that we're not just, although we are owned by the professional association, we are also serving the discipline mainly and located within a very UK focused context. And whether we like it or not, I think that does impact on some of our practices, and that's something that we do need to be reflective about. But I'm going to leave it here because I think there's a lot to say about other issues around EDI. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Toni. So I have a few more questions up my sleeve, but actually I'm aware of time and also very keen to open this up to wider discussion. So I'm wondering if anyone else has a question. So if you use the raise hand function under the participants section if you'd like to ask a question. Okay, in which case, as people formulate their questions, if you're not comfortable kind of speaking live on Facebook, you're also very welcome to use the chat function to type your question. You can post it to the chat and I'm very happy to put it to the panel. So the next question that we really wanted to ask all of you was really, what role do you see associations like UACES having in trying to work towards kind of transforming European studies to make it more inclusive? So we'll go in the same order again, just because it's easier for my head. So we'll go to Anil first, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course. So in a previous life, I was actually the chair of the Equality and Diversity Committee for the UK Political Studies Association at a time when there was a particular focus on issues of EDI, and we put in place a 10-year strategic plan. So to pick up on those experiences and what we did there, just a few things I think. I guess most importantly is to embed equality, diversity, inclusion across the organisation. What I mean by that is it's policies, it's processes, it's governance, it's conferences, it's research network guidelines, prizes, awards, events, annual reporting. You know, across the whole kind of spectrum of areas of the association itself. And that's the most important thing. But a couple of other things to touch upon as well. One of the first steps we took in the PSA was to actually map the discipline. You know, data can be a very powerful force in conversations, particularly when conversing with those who may reject that there are any issues at play. So actually having the data can be is a very important starting point as well. I think there's an important role for professional associations to play in promoting and generating best practice and disseminating best practice in these areas within the profession. And the final thing I'll just touch upon before passing on is, if possible, externally benchmarking the performance of associations like UACES on issues of equality and diversity. For example, having conversations with Advance HE about the Race Equality Charter process and whether professional associations can be part of that in some way, or a revised form of that. So just 3 or 4 things just to start the conversation there.
Thank you, Anil. That's really useful. So we'll go to Kékéli next. So your thoughts on what UACES could be doing and similar associations.
Anil has said a lot. I don't have much to add, possibly to continue to provide spaces like this for reflection, encourage emulation, and whether it's incentives or other ways to keep members across to keep working on the issue. And I know that these are no place for enforcement, but I think it's also about being a place of accountability, that it can't just be meeting on an ad hoc basis and then everything kind of the momentum get lost until we see each other the next time. So I think it would be that, about being a place of accountability, as well as offering a space to really have meaningful conversations.
Thank you. I realise this question gets harder the further along the panel we go. So, Beste, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, Katharine. So first of all, I would like to also thank you, because I also had a look at your website and I have seen that you are offering some online resources for especially junior researchers in terms of how to write an abstract for a conference or some other writing and publication tips. I want to thank you for this, because what might seem as unnecessary or trivial for some of us might actually be a tremendous help for people who lack material and human resources in the institutions that they are based at. So therefore, I really want to say thank you for this. But I think we can do more in terms of promoting pluralism, and I use the word pluralism rather than diversity because diversity also as a concept has been criticized. So we can do it in different ways, especially with the big, let's say, research platforms like UACES. Maybe we can devote some technical and financial resources to special sessions or special workshops that directly deal with issues that have not been engaged with, such as critical race studies or decolonial and post-colonial approaches. So we can maybe devote our energies into organizing this kind of stuff, and also giving the signal that these debates are very much welcome. And I really appreciate Toni's reflections on JCMS, because we also need to also show to the outside that we are open to these kinds of debates, also through representation. That was also an excellent point, telling people that you can also do it. You can also become a board member of UACES or European ISA or the ISA, etc. But we also need to acknowledge that academic exchange, especially face-to-face academic exchange, is very uneven. We face realities such as the international mobility regime, of which visa regime is a very important component. And I tell it from my own experience, and also maybe I can give some examples from what I have experienced. So I am based at the University of Amsterdam, and a few years back we went to the ISA in the United States, and we came with a couple of colleagues back from the ISA, and we were queuing for passport control, and I queued for the passport control for non-European citizens because I am a Turkish citizen. So my colleagues got really surprised, and they were asking me why I wasn't queuing with them. And one of them actually admitted afterwards that, oh yeah, we take it for granted. So because it's for us, it's so easy to travel for academic conferences, and we take it for granted, and we do not acknowledge our privilege, that this is indeed creating some asymmetries and inequalities when it comes to academic exchange. And therefore, maybe what institutions can do is to provide more technical and financial help in terms of enabling this mobility. But I also want to encourage events that are taking place outside what we consider as the core. Organizing, for example, summer or winter schools for junior scholars in the Global South. I'm not saying it necessarily because, yeah, these people cannot come to Europe or shouldn't come to Europe, but there are places in which these people cannot travel at all. And I am specifically talking about dismissed academics in Turkey whose passports are taken away. And through these maybe events, we can also reach out and create platforms for dialogue. And I think this is also a learning process which works in two ways. So it's not about increasing exchanges or enabling participation of scholars in the Global South, but it is also, I think, a way of bringing real change. We should go and see how teaching is done elsewhere. We should go and see what kind of academic discussions are taking place elsewhere. So I think pluralist social sciences is not about adding new members to our club because they are doing research in the way that we do, or they are publishing in the journals that we do, but we have to use this opportunity, like organizing events, as a way to learn and also transform our academic practice.
Great, thank you, Beste. I think that's really important in terms of kind of the visa regime and reflecting on that. And I think if there's any slight silver lining to the whole Corona thing, is that actually, while when things go back to, in inverted commas, normal, perhaps, and we certainly should still have space for these sort of online meetups. And I say that also acknowledging that certain places in the world have difficulty with getting online. So I know there's another layer of problems, but I think it's important that we kind of reflect on those and think about how we can do better. So Toni, your reflections.
Right, I'm going to be very quick because I'm aware that quite a few people have questions. So, I mean, for me, just taking what everybody has said, the key in terms of what institutions can do is about collective action. right? And I say that from the perspective of somebody who does European studies, but I sit very comfortably within African studies as well. I mean the African Studies Association Council, and I sit within security studies and international relations. So if UACES does very fantastic things that I absolutely love, that I'm engaged in, I still get back to my department where I'm engaging with people from different professional associations who may not be as aware. And if our professional associations are supposed to represent us, and they do have to represent us fully, a lot of these issues are systemic. They're not about what a single person or a single organization does. So it does have to be collective. We need to shed silos. There needs to be greater interaction between the professional associations. So Anil mentioned PSA, and there was a time I was also a member of PSA, but at the time he was in that position. I was no longer a member of PSA. And although PSA represents all of politics, the extent to which I knew anything about EDI doesn't exist. And I imagine it's the same about members of PSA knowing about what is that UACES is doing. And I think that this can be this sort of cross-fertilization or integration could be really important. I think that while I'm very aware, having been in the position before, that there are restrictions on precisely what it is that charity organizations registered like UACES or some of the other professional organizations can do, that there does need to be more of an advocacy roles. Now you need to be engaging heads of departments, and heads of departments are not going to have the title of European studies. They're going to have the title of anthropology and sociology and political science and international relations, that we do need to be engaging them, because some of them are our members if we're lucky, some of them are not. So to, at least try to mitigate the violences of classrooms, to increase or at least to render visible the things that are invisible, to articulate the silences that currently exist, then we do need collective action and more advocacy from our professional associations. Thank you.
Thank you, Toni. Yeah, I think that that's some really important points, and I know certainly taking on the UACES EDI role, kind of conversations with colleagues in BISA on what they were doing were really useful when we turned to what we were doing, and hopefully that those conversations need to continue going forward. So we have some questions coming in from the chat from people who I guess don't want to become infamous on Facebook or YouTube for good reasons. So we have one from Wan O'Dwyer, and she's asking, she says, first of all, thanks for all the great contributions so far. I was wondering if the contributors have thoughts on how the historic homogeneity of EU studies has influenced theories of integration and even our understanding of what the EU is. So who would like to take that one first?
I'll have a go at it, but not coming from an academic perspective, but being, I guess, working with people who have gone through European. I will say two words: Fortress Europe. I think it's something that the idea of Europe being under siege is something that is very prevalent in EU policy making. It is about that sense of us versus them. It's about identity and the fear of losing identity if too many people are allowed in, because it feels to me, looking at that European integration might not be as solid as it seems, or possibly because it might be based on assumptions that did not bear much resemblance to the reality of life in Europe. But Fortress Europe is what keeps on coming to me. It is about and being so full, I guess, as I said earlier, being so full of certainty about what Europe is, that when those assumptions are challenged by real life, then there is retreat, and there is, and I can see in the policy making, the European policy making work, that security becomes a priority, and everything to do with the position of Europe in the world, it is about protecting European interests, European identity, as if identity cannot be multiple, as if identity is fixed and doesn't change. So.
Great, thank you, Kékéli. Would anyone else like to comment on that question? You don't have to, but.
Well, I can say something very briefly. I mean, I was preparing for my teaching next week, and one of the things I was struck by, because I teach European security, is the fact that a lot of my colleagues take for granted Robert Cox's statement around the fact that, you know, theory is for everybody, right? Is for someone. So it's not neutral. And we repeat this over and over and over again, but we never seem to apply it when we're talking about EU studies, to ask that question, you know, what exactly is Europe, and whose knowledge determines what Europe is? I don't actually have an answer to how you can stop doing that. I mean, I think that's a longer conversation, but again, I would call for greater self-reflexivity. The short answer to the question is, well, absolutely, that homogeneity has had an impact, so people can keep saying the same things but not actually mean anything to them. They just mean it for other people.
Okay, so we have a few more questions coming in. So we have a couple of questions related to kind of the teaching. So the first question I'll put to the panel is from Jan Orby, who says, great panel, practical question. For most of us, this requires some effort to make a decolonial U-turn. So is there any place, so book, blog, website, that assembles relevant material, not just reading lists, but also beyond? So I would add to that to look up Beste's Decolonizing Europe YouTube channel. I've certainly used that for some of my teaching this year. But yeah, over to you before I monopolize my time as chair.
Well, I am not aware of any book, blog, or website that combines everything, but what we want to also achieve with the UACES Decolonizing series is that we are also offering reading suggestions for each session. So if you subscribe to the newsletter before every event, we ask our speakers from their own research, but also some studies that are related to the topics of discussion, and we inform the audience that yeah, these are the readings that you might want to engage with before coming to the session. Apart from that, I mean, I'm a student of decolonial studies. I'm reading every day something new. I would say that starting with edited books, which start from international relations, I mean, the discipline that I come from, and see also how they deal with the individual concepts of IR and political science, and move beyond that. But apart from it, I'm not aware of any platform that brings together, assembles everything.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. I think, yeah, I'm of the same thinking as Beste, that I'm not aware of any single place where these things exist. However, what I would say, and what I would encourage from my own experience and at my own institution, Warwick University, that a group of us have created a reading list, a single space of resources. And actually that's been really useful. And that's part of the journey, the collective journey that individual institutions, that professional associations, that we all need to go on to actually take this so-called decolonial U-turn. You know, it is very much a journey, and actually going through that process with others is a really useful and powerful experience.
second Anil's point about going through it with others. I think reading is one thing, but there has to be a didactic element. There has to be things has to be talked through. And I think I've also seen, I wouldn't say the danger, but some of the challenges of some of reading some of the material, but staying in a very well, non-inclusive space. So all white reading books, that is a step, but there's a need to move beyond that. There is also a need to have those conversations also in inclusive spaces, even if it means that they become less comfortable. But I think this is important. And I think it's also one of the, having moved online, it might possibly be easier to find people willing to have those conversations.
Great, and Emily has posted that UACES has a reading list as part of the DIMES project on race, racism and identity in European studies. So if you're watching this on YouTube, you can find that on the UACES website. If you're in the Zoom call, you can just click on the link there, and that's a really good set of resources there. I don't know, I muted myself. So then the next question is also on the theme of kind of teaching. And so Vivian Gravi asks, I wonder if the contributors have thoughts on how COVID and the move towards online learning is creating opportunities, or perhaps conversely challenges, decolonizing European studies curriculum and pedagogies. And I guess I just add to that, if the panel perhaps had any thoughts. I know, Anil, you talk about kind of making these spaces where students can kind of discuss the kind of issues at hand, but I guess the challenge that I've had, just to abuse my position as chair, is how do we know that sort of learning is kind of happening in the online space when we feel perhaps detached? So I don't mind who wants to address that first.
Yeah, I can jump in if that's okay. From talking to colleagues across the country who work in this sphere, I'm getting I'm hearing that unfortunately other priorities are coming to the fore, should we say, in this time where a lot of institutions are struggling to adapt to teaching and learning and assessment and new ways of teaching, learning and assessment within the doing it online. That institutional resources and institutional priorities are being very much sucked into that area, and other issues which were looking like they were going to be a priority are now falling down the ladder, the hierarchical ladder. So yeah, I'm not hearing such positive stories, unfortunately, about the focus, despite the Black Lives Matter context and the focus on that. I think many in university senior management have their eyes on other challenges, which they see as more pressing at the moment within the HE sphere.
Great, thank you, Anil. Does anyone else, Toni?
Yeah, I mean, I think Anil's point, which I think is similar to what I know and what I hear, is what underscores why we cannot look at these issues as something that you do because Black Lives Matter happened, or simply in the context of doing a kite mark, whether it's Athena Swan or the Race Equality Chapter. And we need to think about transforming the system and embedding it within the system. But to go back specifically to the question, I mean, I think it's one of those things which would sound like a cop-out now, where those things can be happening at the same time, right? We have students who, to use a terrible term, are impacted by what is known as the digital poverty, who do not have access to laptops and who do not have access to stable internet. I mean, I'm a senior lecturer, my internet is barely stable. So do not have access to a safe space in what is currently their home, or even a room of their own in which to sort of engage with some of these issues. And they're sort of dealing with, you know, bread and butter issues, so to speak. But that does not mean that they're not engaging with the bigger issues. So I am wary of sort of dichotomizing their inability to engage versus their ability to absorb knowledge, but also their commitment to some of these ideals. By the same token, there are lots of people who have 3 laptops and can easily sit on a panel and listen and check a box of having listened, but do they actually invoke any of that in their everyday practices around decolonizing? And I think this is what's important. As you know, in my limited understanding, the decolonial turn, and I hesitate to use that word because it's often used by hegemonic knowledge producers anyway, but it's about the practice. Decoloniality is about the practice. It's also about acknowledging people's, minoritized people who are often of the majority world's lived experiences. You cannot have a totally radical decolonial syllabus and then treat your disabled trans student of color like crap. It does not work. That is not decolonial. And on the one hand, it might be easy for an individual to ensure that they don't do that. But when the institution keeps doing that in this kind of, you know, I read somewhere recently, in a sort of slow violence type of way, then, you know, this is why we keep having problems, right? And I think Anil is absolutely right that, you know, we are sitting on this precipice where we're being told we don't have the finances, and so all of that falls to the wayside. And this is not surprising to any scholar who does decolonial work or feminist work, that in times of crisis, you know, these are the things that tend to fall away, precisely because they've not been embedded in the system, precisely because senior management only cares about managing, not leading, and have absolutely no understanding of why this cannot simply be an end in its own. And, you know, I'm afraid to say I have absolutely no faith in any, in my context, UK higher institution. You know, from the engagements that we've seen in the summer, I can maybe count 5 universities where I see where, you know, there's a bit of a move towards like thinking about this reflectively, but we'll see how that pans out. But 5 universities out of 100 some universities is not a good recommendation. And again, I'm only talking in the context of the UK. But we also have to remember that we're not apart from society. We are within society, in a society that is currently facing massive backlash against the dignity and the lived experiences of minoritized people. So what do we do in that context? When we are thinking about decolonizing curriculums and we're thinking about learning practices, we cannot divorce this from the broader context and societal context within which we exist. Thank you.
Any of the other panel have anything to add? So we've got a question from Emily Linneman, who says she has a question, but it might be easier to say it rather than type. So Emily, do you want to say your question? Hello.
Okay, hello, sorry. Sorry, I'm using my privilege as Executive Director now. Sorry, this is going to be a slightly roundabout way of getting there, but I was looking today at the Oscars, and they've just announced that they've got these new diversity criteria that, you know, they're hoping that that's going to help them to get away from the Oscars so white controversy and to maybe kind of diversify the films, for instance, that are nominated for Best Film. But the BBC had kind of done an investigation of how the same diversity criteria had helped BAFTA last year, and actually had basically ended up with the same kinds of people standing on the podium getting the awards. Now, UACES has criteria for our scholarships, for instance, but in the same way, they actually haven't necessarily helped to diversify in the way I think we hoped they would. so that, you know, we still have a lot of white Western students getting our scholarships, when the point was that we wanted to try and branch out to different regions to hopefully bring in students of colour into the association and to, you know, support their research. So I suppose my question is, with that context, is what do the panel think about those sorts of diversity criteria? Do you think they're helpful? Do you think they need to be refocused? Because I think that's definitely a place where associations can do something, but perhaps we haven't been doing the right thing yet.
Open to whoever wants to say.
Right. So, thanks, Emily. I mean, yes, I also read that article as a pop culture fan. So, for me, before we move on to the specifics of our context, the reason why that happens is because once you set the criteria, the same sort of people are like, oh, great, so we know what to do, we'll just include that. I mean, probably next year is going to be Marvel, right? Like, they've got a few things coming out recently that is not just white superheroes, so they might win it. For me, part of making the change happen is that people need to be willing to step aside. You cannot want transformation and not be willing to reckon with yourself, whether it's as an individual or as an organization. Which brings me to the issue of scholarships. There's a very easy way to deal with that. Just ring fence who will get what. Previously unrepresented groups, as far as I know, there are exceptions to for that kind of intervention in the law. So if you really wanted to do that, one could do that, and quite a few people have. I mean, when I was preparing for today, one of the things I was reflecting on was, for example, you know, we complain a lot in the academy about the fact that there are only 30 Black women in the whole of the UK across all disciplines, just over 100 Black men who've made it to professor level. But why is that the case? I mean, there are lots of reasons, but one reason that a lot of us have known, but has come up to the fore recently is around funding. Who gets funded and what gets funded, right? So, you know, I have this in-joke with some of my fellow travelers about doing research on gender and doing research on gender in Africa. If I wanted to do research on gender in Africa and about African women being sexually violated, it would be far easier for me to get the funding than if I wanted to do research about African women contributing to knowledge and global normative frameworks. That's a fact. And a lot of people of color would echo the same. So we need to be willing to step aside and to have a reckoning with ourselves and to be really reflective of it. It's not going to make everybody happy. And I think that, you know, that's the other issue, that we need to be willing to upset the status quo. Because, you know, it's not personal. We all know that, and we say that as many times as possible. But we need to be willing to upset the status quo, and it's not going to be easy. And it has to be on this, in the same way that, you know, a lot of us were willing to put our heads above the parapet for Brexit. Then we need to be willing to do this as well.
So, Beste and Kékéli.
Yeah, well, as a follow-up on what Toni has said, I completely agree with what Toni has said, especially about self-reflection. I think we should aim for equal outcomes rather than equal opportunities, because a lot of discussion is about equal opportunities. And I want to maybe give an example from a very recent experience within my department, when a group of colleagues, we made the point that more maybe funding should be given to projects that are underrepresented in our department, and these are the issues that we also deal with our online series. And that was all what we said. We need more funding to projects that are underfunded. And then we got an email from a professor who has won all these prestigious grants, an angry email and saying that you can't tell me my research is less important than yours. We didn't say that. We just said we need more funding to underrepresented research. And I completely agree with Toni in the sense that I think funding is very important. And if I have to give an example from the Dutch context, maybe because, I think most of you are from the UK context, and it is very different from the UK context, what we are actually facing in the Netherlands when it comes to PhD training and PhD funding. So there are very important structural conditions which I think hamper diversity and pluralism in Dutch academia, because PhD training and PhD positions are intimately linked to big projects that are let's say that are the products of let's say senior researchers. So this definitely affects what we expect from the future generations. So we have some external PhDs, but most of the time we hire PhDs as employees of projects that are led by senior researchers, for example, a European Research Council grant or a grant by the Life Science Foundation. But the effect of this is as follows. So the PhD project becomes the product of this bigger project run by the senior researcher. So there is very little room for individual researchers to develop their ideas, because they want to be employed for these projects, so they are writing proposals in order to fit in this project. So the outcome is that the system reproduces itself because some topics are overrepresented than others. And this especially applies to European studies, where the Dutch academia is very well known for its success of getting grants from ERC in European studies, but especially projects that are following a certain tradition of doing academic research. Therefore, we cannot include people who want, for example, do research on race or decolonialism or some of the examples that Toni has given, without a senior researcher getting a grant in the first place. So I think the individual outcome is also very much dependent on the structural conditions in which we have to operate.
Just wanted to ask you, Emily, how much time do you have? Because it might sound flippant, but it feels like you're either 15 years too late or 15 years too early when you're talking about the scholarship. And I'm saying that because, as Toni said, academia doesn't exist in a vacuum. And by the time a student is ready to apply, they would have gone through a whole educational system that is not geared to encourage some people to pursue certain paths. And I'll take me as an example. I went to school both in Togo, both in France. And by the time it was time to choose an area of further studies, there was no way I would have gone towards European studies, because it felt that I already sat through years of looking at Europe in relation to the world, Europe, and I could see the disconnection, I could see the gap, I could see where I did not fit, and that's not something I wanted to pursue further. So I think it is about starting from much early on, and it is about equality of outcome from toddler all the way up to university graduate. It's a whole spectrum. So it's also about patience and how, and these commitments have to be long-term commitments. It is about those bursaries being there in 15 years time when my child is ready to go to university, and not because it's not trendy anymore, those opportunity has gone. So that it is about time and patience, and it's also the frustration of how we see those issues are urgent, because they are, but the system still need to change, and we have to bring the collective up to pace.
I'd just add, Emily, well, just to echo what others have said here. Unfortunately, I'm not surprised by what you mentioned either. I guess to a certain extent, it links into what I said at the very beginning in terms of from the race perspective. Students of colour simply do not see themselves in European studies when they are studying it. So why would they go into it later on?
Thank you. So I'm wary of time. So we've got a question here, from Roberta Greener. She's messaged me this question. So she's picking up on some of the points that Anil and Toni in particular were making a bit earlier on. So Roberta asked, how do we bring colleagues and students along with us? So she says, this is clearly a moment that has opened a space for some important discussions. However, far too often it is always the same people who raise issues to do with gender, race, etc. Do you have suggestions of how we can make others responsible for doing that work? I think this is kind of gets to the heart of some of what we're talking about. So would anyone like to jump in on Roberta's question?
I can just say a few things there. Roberta's absolutely right in terms of when I run training sessions on critical race theory, on anti-racist pedagogy, it's the same faces that turn up to the sessions, and they're not normally the senior management faces of the institution, let's put it that way. They're not the people who wield the power in the institution who are going to make change. So that can be enforced. If we had the buy-in of the institution, of the senior management. However, I guess the wider issue here is how can we make it attractive to those who hold positions of power to engage with this? And that goes back to the issue of how can we embed this within the discipline and the profession within which we work? For example, I would say experience or demonstrating experience in these issues should be part of the reward process. It should be part of the promotion criteria within our disciplines, within our institutions. The fact that many of our colleagues see this as an adjunct to their core roles and something that they would like to do, but is it really worth it? Because what will it actually get them in their careers? And the reason they think that way is because it is, generally speaking, and something which they will not be rewarded for.
I'll go. That's a really hard question, and I think Anil really answered it. But I mean, just picking up off of the point that you made about, making it a criteria, the one thing that I've been struck by is how when you ask people to implement something that is supposed to be reflective of equality or pluralism, they always tend to latch on to the most negative extreme as a reason not to do certain things. And I mean, I must say, perhaps I'm naive, but it's been really surprising, especially with regards to this whole COVID thing, because I actually think one of the things that planning for the move online, not necessarily the move online itself, has done is open up the space to perhaps not just talk about issues around gender and race, which always seem to be quite visceral, but to think through issues around class, for example, issues around ableism, for example, which you would think surely any quote unquote rational thinking person would be on board for this. But it's been quite surprising that even those seemingly obvious connections are not being made, right? Like, how do you account for someone who is from a working class background, who has to work, for example, to make ends meet, and therefore actually requiring them to be in a live seminar at a time that they've had no control over previously, is perhaps not a great thing to be insisting on, right? Like, it's not the end of the world. And I've been quite surprised by that. But I think that the only reason why people are able to do this is the failure of leadership and the failure of the failure of the people who hold management positions, who are just not being leaders, who've allowed this kind of basic things to be siloed. Every institution I've worked for has talked about widening participation. I know people who work in widening participation who work their butts off. And yet when I go back to sort of how management is actually thinking about that, it's not integrated into even their own practices of how they govern our institutions. And honestly, that is embarrassing, well, for them, but it's also a disgrace, I would say, for our sector. So I don't have a good answer to Roberta's question, except that those of us who have any modicum of power, just, we need to put our foot down, and we need to be the complainers, Sarah Ahmed's complainers, and there are costs. I think we should not be naive about the fact that there are costs, and at sometimes you do have to retreat. But for those people who are listening, who are in positions of power, who've felt that, softly being nice does it, it doesn't. It clearly doesn't. And your minoritized students are in pain, because every day is the violence.
Thank you, Toni. I don't know if Beste or Kékéli had anything to add in. Don't know why I keep muting myself. Clearly, I just need to master Zoom for my online teaching. So we've got one last question from Magdalena Koenig. So she says, perhaps a difficult, or even more difficult than decolonizing practices, is decolonizing theory. So when we refer to philosophers or theorists whose ideas have influenced the development of contemporary theories, how can we decolonize them? So I'm aware we have 4 minutes left. So I don't know if anyone has any quick thoughts on Magdalena's tricky question on kind of theory and theorists.
I'll say very, very quickly. I think this is probably the most challenging aspect of the so-called decolonizing the curriculum agenda. It's about relearning our disciplines, and it's about fundamentally questioning the canon on which our disciplines are based, and what we learnt as students and what we know, and actually either lobbying our institutions to change this, or unfortunately what seems to happen a lot is people having to do it in their own time. And from my own perspective, myself having to read about the Haitian Revolution myself, because I was only taught about the US and French revolutions in my political science degree, and just having to spend your own time doing it. But that is the fundamental challenge. It's about relearning our canons, really.
I agree that I think we need to engage with what is already out there. So we also need to acknowledge that there are debates that are happening in parallel with each other. So we also need to look at those people who have been working on European Union from critical perspectives for already 3 decades and even more, and we have to ask our questions about which journals do they prefer to publish. So when we also critically reflect on our publication strategies, and I really appreciate Toni's point about JCMS, we need to look at who gets access to these journals, and what epistemic practices are considered to be good scientific practices and therefore get access to the journals that we consider as mainstream European journals or top IR journals. Because academic practice is already happening. What we need to do is to go and read these, because the theory has already been colonized. What we need to do is to include it into our reading lists for our students, but also do a bit more work at the publication level, in the sense that we have to also give a signal to others that we are willing to engage with these theories, that these debates should not or do not necessarily have to happen independent of each other, where some people are publishing in mainstream journals and others in other journals because they feel that their ideas are not welcomed in the mainstream publication outlets.
I mean, I would just say, for me personally, I don't see the point of going back to try to decolonize an established theory, because if you understand the history of that particular approach, then it's kind of a waste of time. Now, we can, however, put more effort into sort of decolonizing our fields and subfields of study. So I wouldn't say, you cannot decolonize a theory of multi-level governance, but you can try to decolonize your understanding of multi-level governance, to sort of use an EU or European specific example. I think, going off of what Beste said is like, be willing to draw in those people that we've sort of previously discounted and not really acknowledged. I was saying to a colleague earlier today that I'm quite wary of this idea of turns, because oftentimes when we say we're turning to something, people have been doing it for like 60 years, and then we're finally sort of saying, okay, we want to do it now, and then we've discovered the field. So I'm quite wary of that, and I think that, in order to sort of move forward, that we should not, definitely as EU studies, we shouldn't be complicit in that either. But there are ways of engaging the work that is already there, but also experiential knowledge, because as I said, what we theorize is very much the whole, where decoloniality comes from is, the idea of the here and now, and the experiences is what has informed theory. And we can't lose sight of that when we're doing the work in the academy.
I found it an interesting question, because I was thinking maybe because I am not in academia, but so it felt very, in moments like, well, if there is practice, it means the theory was there, but people were not looking at it for various reasons. So it's about, I think it's about looking at why some of the knowledge that was there wasn't considered legitimate enough to be considered, and why now we would need to theorize again. Is it so that it can shape existing canon and still become comfortable, rather than us stepping out of a comfort zone and doing things differently and looking at the practices and looking at all the knowledge production from a perspective not of power, but from becoming to learn and to join rather than wanting to lead? Because I think there's also the idea of Europe leading. Maybe it is about getting out of those binary linear thinking, and it is about looking at what's already there, because a lot of it is. And I also think that separating theory and practice, I'm not sure how that works, and maybe because I am on the field and I do consider Europe as my field of my field work, because it's endlessly fascinating, but both goes hand in hand together. And I think people should not become complacent and be like, yes, we are doing it. This is about lifelong commitment. It's about generational commitment. So there will never be too much decolonizing practices. And when we feel we have done enough, read enough, then it's the time to read even more and do even more.
Thank you. So that brings us very nicely to time. So I just want to say thank you to the UACES team for getting us live onto Facebook. I don't know how you've done it, but it's a first for me. I want you to say thank you to our audience for being here and also for your engaging questions. And I also want to really thank for all of you to join me in thanking our panel. So Beste, Anil, Toni and Kékéli, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to take part in what I think you'll agree has been an enriching, engaging, but also a challenging discussion. I know I, for one, will certainly be revisiting this on YouTube. And I think Kékéli kind of pointed to this. I think it's on all of us now in this Zoom room to put words into action and actually continue to do better in what we're doing, to learn more and know that this work will never end. So thank you.